Afternoon. This thing is on. I'm Father Bill Daly. I'm a priest of the Congregation of Holy Cross. I teach some law here, and I run a men's residence hall for my sins. And I think that I was asked to chair the panel on faith and reason because half of the Center for Ethics and Culture, of which I am the Thomas More Fellow, thinks I lack faith, and the other half think I lack reason. And so whatever I hear today, I'm sure to gain. I also, for a few years, worked in Dublin, Ireland. I was the founding director of Notre Dame's John Henry Newman Center for Faith and Reason on St. Stephen's Green in the church that he built for the Catholic University of Ireland. And my little preface to this talk is beginning there because we have an Irish priest in our midst. I promised I wouldn't point him out, but he noted that he was delighted to come here and that the morning speakers, he said, were superb, and this doesn't happen in Ireland, and that the bishops of Ireland have no energy for educating in the faith in the way that this conference is doing. And I wouldn't say Ireland is unique in this regard. So we are so blessed by what the De Nicola Center is able to do and chooses to do and gives the energy to do and whose benefactors give us the funding to do. I listened to the GPS program on CNN yesterday, and they were talking about secularization in America. And having run a Center for Faith and Reason in Dublin from 2016 to 2020, I used to say to my friends in America about how secularized Ireland had become, that it is a tsunami, and it is coming to our shores. It's a little delayed, but it is not avoidable. And so it's so important that we gather in this place with the marvelous people that we have to hear from today. And I will now shut up and just tell you who they are, and we will get to hear from them. So to my left is my dear old friend. He's dear, and we are old friends. He's not at all old himself. Father Kevin Flannery of the Society of Jesus, a great Jesuit emeritus professor of the history of ancient philosophy at the Greg, as we call it, the Pontifical Gregorian University. He is also a consultor for the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith. His publications include Ways into the Logic of Alexander of Aphrodisias, but obviously you know that, and Acts and Precepts, the Aristotelian logical structure of Thomas Aquinas' moral theory, which will be in its Broadway debut this spring. He has been a member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas, past president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association, and appointed as the holder of Creighton University's Anna and Donald Waite Endowed Chair in Jesuit Education for the 2021 academic year. He is the current Ralph McInerney Distinguished Research Fellow at the Jacques Maritain Center here at the University of Notre Dame. After we hear from Father Kevin, we will hear from Tracy Rowland. I'm so excited. I served as a lawyer in Washington, D.C. When Tracy's work on Benedict was introduced to me by the head of the Catholic Information Center there, a great priest named Father Arnie Panula of happy memory. Some of you may know him. So it's such an honor to have Professor Tracy here. She holds the St. John Paul II Chair of Theology here at Notre Dame, Australia, rather. She is a member of the editorial board of the English edition of the journal Communio, International Review, which was co-founded by Joseph Ratzinger at the time, as he was known. She was a member of the Ninth International Theological Commission, is currently a member of the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences, the author of 2 books on the theology of Joseph Ratzinger, the English sub-editor of the forthcoming Ratzinger Lexicon by Ignatius Press, and co-author of the Oxford Companion to Ratzinger with the University of Notre Dame, Francesca Murphy. Professor Rowland received her doctorate in divinity from Cambridge University, where she wrote her doctoral dissertation on 20th century theological engagements with the idea of culture, with reference to the philosophy of Alistair MacIntyre, obviously intimate relationship with the De Nicola Center, and the theology of Henri de Lubac and Joseph Ratzinger. In 2020, the Ratzinger Foundation awarded her the Ratzinger Prize for Theology. So other than Pope Benedict XVI and his brother, you are the most Ratzingerian of Ratzingerians that one could possibly imagine, given that resume. And finally, Father Alessandro Clemenzia is the Vice Dean of the Theological Faculty of Central Italy, a professor in ecclesiology at the Theological Faculty of Florence, and as of this year has been teaching ecclesiology and Mariology at the Pontifical Lateran University in Rome. He received his baccalaureate in theology and his licentiate in dogmatic theology from the Gregorian. Perhaps he studied with Father Kevin and completed his doctorate at the Pontifical Lateran University with a thesis entitled From the Trinitarian We to the Ecclesial We, in dialogue with the theological project of Heribert Mühlen. He received his postdoctoral degree in the Department of Trinitarian Ontology, where he published a monograph on the concept of unum in Augustine of Hippo. He then received his master's degree in philosophy from the University of Perugia with a thesis entitled Polar Tension and the Reading of the Real, the contribution of Georg Simmel. Very impressive stuff. He is the author of several publications, the latest of which, edited with Roberto Rigoli, is Ratzinger and the Church Research Approaches. We will now hear from Father Kevin.
Thank you very much, Father Daly, for that kind introduction. We are good old friends, and I am old. Okay. Actually, this talk was composed at a desk, so I'll deliver it from the desk. I had little face-to-face contact with Cardinal Ratzinger while he was prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and even less once he was Pope Benedict XVI. Nonetheless, through conversations with those working under him at the CDF, I learned that he was always open to discussing controversial issues, even with those who might be described as mere employees of the congregation. Another case in point, not that of an employee at the congregation, would be that of the theologian Walter Casper. It is well known that Joseph Ratzinger did not agree with Walter Casper on a number of prominent issues. And yet, certainly with Cardinal Ratzinger's assent, in 1999, Casper was appointed president of the Pontifical Council for Christian Unity, and in 2001 made a cardinal by John Paul II. One related personal memory sticks out for me. In 2005, as I was approaching the main entrance of the CDF, where I intended to put on a cassock before attending the Mass immediately preceding the conclave at which Cardinal Ratzinger was elected Pope, emerging from that same entrance to the CDF were Cardinals Ratzinger and Casper in friendly conversation. I just regard that as almost a symbol. I also recall a meeting that Cardinal Ratzinger called of all the professors at the Gregorian University, where I teach, as has been mentioned, in anticipation of John Paul II's 1998 apostolic letter Ad Tuendum Fidem, and the CDF's reformulation of the profession of faith and the oath of fidelity required of professors of theology and philosophy. The idea of the meeting, initiated, as I said, by Cardinal Ratzinger, was to engage in dialogue regarding the relationship between theologians and the Holy See, that is, the magisterium. It was my impression before the meeting that the majority of the professors teaching at the Gregorian did not like the prefect of the CDF, or at least what they had heard about him. That was not the case at dinner immediately following the meeting. There were doubtless some holdouts, but he was roundly praised for his openness and for his intellectual charity. Joseph Ratzinger was never reluctant to hear the arguments of those who were sure that he disagreed with them. In so doing, his purpose was always to enter more fully with his interlocutors into the truth. This willingness, a passion to enter into dialogue, is apparent throughout Pope Benedict XVI's Regensburg address, including its controversial quotations of remarks by the 14th, 15th century Byzantine Emperor Manuel II Palaeologus. In the documents from which the quotations are taken by Benedict XVI, Manuel is in conversation with, as he's described, a learned Persian that is a Muslim. And I quote from Manuel. "Show me just what Muhammad brought that was new," says Manuel to the Persian, "and there you will find things only evil and inhuman, such as his command to spread by the sword the faith he preached." Emperor Manuel then continues as follows, again this is a quotation. "God is not pleased by blood, and not acting rationally is contrary to God's nature. Faith is born of the soul, not the body. Whoever would lead someone to faith needs to speak well and reason properly, without violence or threats. To convince a reasonable soul, psyche logicae is the term used there, one does not need a strong arm or weapons of any kind, or any other means of threatening a person with death." That's the end of the quotation. Benedict's use of these remarks immediately ignited the ire of certain Muslims throughout the world. He delivered the Regensburg Address on the 12th of September 2006, less than a year and a half after the beginning of his pontificate. By the 16th of September, that is a couple of days later, the newly appointed Secretary of State, Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone, was forced to issue a declaration in which he relayed Benedict's continued adherence to the document from Vatican II, Nostra Aetate, which states that Muslims, and I quote, "adore the one God living and subsisting in himself." Cardinal Bertone also called attention to Benedict's continued, and again, I quote, "esteem for those who profess the Islamic faith." On the following day, Somali gunmen shot and killed an Italian nun, Sister Leonella Scorbati, who had been working in a children's hospital there. Cardinal Bertone's declaration was unlike many of the clarifications issuing in our day from the Vatican. He was not spinning an unfortunate and less than careful remark. Benedict's desire was not to alienate, but rather to engage with Muslims, and that was made explicit in words immediately preceding his quotation of Manuel. That is the quotation regarding Muhammad's advocacy of spreading the faith by sword. Benedict spoke, that is, of Manuel's, and I quote, addressing his interlocutor with a startling brusqueness, a brusqueness that we, that is Benedict, find unacceptable. And that's in the actual text itself. And immediately after the quotation regarding the unreasonable use of weapons in order to convince a reasonable soul, Benedict remarks, and I quote again, "The decisive statement in this argument against violent conversion is this: not to act in accordance with reason is contrary to God's nature." At this point, in a note appended later, Benedict wrote, "It was purely, and I quote, it was purely for the sake of this statement that I quoted the dialogue between Manuel and his Persian interlocutor. In this statement, the theme of my subsequent reflections emerges." So that's the content of this address, as he states. Although his reflections do begin and continue with criticisms of certain strains of Muslim thought, Benedict does, as we shall see, go on to apply these criticisms more generally. That said, however, it would be well worth our while considering here first these strains of Muslim thought, since they bring to light, by their contrasting darkness, the more general moral issue. Benedict goes on to draw upon ideas put forward by Theodore Curie, who was editor of the text and French translation of as it's translated in our English translation of the discourse. So translated as an argument or controversy between Manuel and the learned Persian. In fact, Benedict, sticking closer to the Greek, called this argument or controversy rather Gesprächsrunde, that is a conversation. And in fact, you find this throughout the text that Benedict XVI has changed the terminology in a number of places in order, and in fact, sticking more closely to the Greek, and in order to bring out that this was not an argument or a controversy, but rather a dialogue. In fact, that's at one point in the Greek text, the word dialogos is used, but in fact it's ignored by Curie. But anyhow, Pope Benedict then goes on to quote Curie, and the editor Theodore Curie observes in this quotation, "For the emperor, as a Byzantine shaped by Greek philosophy, this statement, that is, that acting not in accordance with reason is contrary to God's nature, is self-evident for him, the emperor. But for Muslim teaching, God is absolutely transcendent. His will is not bound by any of our categories, even that of rationality." Here, notes Benedict, Curie quotes a work of a noted French Islamist who pointed out in this quotation, he cites Ibn Hazm, Muslim, who went so far as to state that God is not bound even by his own word, and that nothing would oblige him to reveal the truth to us. Were it God's will, we would even have to practice idolatry. What interests Benedict in all of this is the contrast depicted by Curie between Greek philosophy and philosophy according to which God is, and again to quote, not bound by any of our categories, not even that of rationality. Later in the address, Benedict advocates combining Greek philosophy with the Christian faith. But it's clear that what distinguishes the approach he advocates from that of Ibn Hazm is the Greek emphasis upon logos, that is, reason, which is present in Christianity as it soars, hologos, the word. It is faith's, that is, any faith's, essential existence in reason, logos, that excludes any sort of coercion to believe. It must be acknowledged that this truth has regularly been rejected over the course of history, and not only by Muslims in Islamic history, but also in Christian history. The case in point would be Visigothic Spain, in which well into the 7th century, baptism was forced upon certain Jews. But the rejection of the moral and so religious significance of reason is bound up with a problem that is most evident in today's world. If one truly believes that to act morally is to act rationally, one must also acknowledge that the character of human acts themselves have an intelligible structure. For acting rationally is a matter of performing acts that are consonant with reason. In my opinion, the best philosophical progress in this regard has been made from within the Aristotelian tradition. For there we find set out distinctions, such as the distinction between direct killing of an innocent person and performing an action, possibly in self-defense, that has as an unintended side effect the death of an innocent person. A religion or subdivision of a religion that holds that God's will supersedes our categories of rationality in such a way that those categories become morally irrelevant once God's will is supposedly clear, will not concern itself with distinctions such as the distinction between an unjust aggressor and an innocent non-aggressor. And so, supposing that God wills the elimination of a certain class of people and or state, the only thing impeding what reason truly regards as murder would be more general strategic considerations. Similarly, those adhering to such a religious ideology would not be troubled morally about using patients in a hospital as human shields, thereby impeding attacks by rationally conscientious opponents. On the other hand, commanders of a military force commanders that recognize the rational distinction between the targeting of combatants and the targeting of civilians would make efforts both to instruct and control their soldiers regarding that distinction and to avoid harm to civilians. One encounters the phenomenon of deliberate looking away from the rational structure of human acts, not only among recipients of supposed divine inspiration, but also among adherents of political ideologies, such as the pro-choice ideology. Again, the key principle is that an action that has as its object the death of an innocent human being is an action contrary to human reason, and so immoral. But an ideology that regards personal liberty, for instance, as the supreme criterion of permissible action will make every effort to look away from the fact that the object of an abortion is an innocent human being. So let me conclude with one final idea, which is, in fact, is found towards the end of the Regensburg Address. Although in this address, not to mention in his dealings with all people, Benedict XVI embraced dialogue, he did not regard dialogue itself as the ultimate end, but rather the truth. Reconciling, however, these two, that is, dialogue and truth, is a delicate matter, which Benedict considers towards the end of this address, the Regensburg Address, where he draws on another ancient Greek source, that is Plato, and in particular the dialogue entitled the Phaedo. Very interestingly, the Phaedo begins with a debate, a sort of sub-dialogue, about the morality of taking one's own life. The dialogue's main character, Socrates, has been condemned for corrupting the youth with his philosophy, and so sentenced to death. As we know from another Platonic dialogue, the Crito, Socrates might easily have escaped that sentence by accompanying his friend Crito to another city-state, that is Thessaly. But he has chosen to remain in Athens and so to die. To die, that is, by his own hand, by consuming poison. Although Socrates has decided to stay in Athens, his position in his discussion, that is dialogue with his two friends, that is Chabius and Simmias, is a shifting one. He first suggests that a true philosopher might kill himself, but then argues that the moral principle against killing oneself is alone of all such principles without exception, since killing oneself is to remove oneself from the service of the gods. His interlocutors express agreement with this argument, but then Socrates changes direction again and argues that in the afterlife, one is closer to the gods than in the present life, and so one can commit suicide. All this is pertinent to a later passage in the Phaedo that Benedict, towards the very end of the address, paraphrases. The original passage, paraphrased by Benedict, is spoken by the character Socrates, of course, who certainly has in mind the sort of debate he engages in at the beginning of the dialogue, and in which he reverses his initial position, then reverses his reversal. Socrates says in the dialogue that it would be pitiable if, when there is a true and reliable argument and one that can be understood, if a man who has dealt with such arguments as appear at one time true, at another time untrue, should not blame himself for his own lack of skill, but because of his distress, in the end gladly shift the blame away from himself and to the arguments, and spend the rest of his life hating and reviling reasonable discussion, and so be deprived of truth and knowledge of reality. This is the Regensburg Address's concluding and conclusive argument, that engaging in reasoning, in dialogue, although frustrating at times, is our only way to that at which reason aims, that is the truth. Any other way, whether it be the autocratic placing oneself above reason and or deliberately looking away from what is obvious, is not God's way, which is precisely the way of truth and the light. Thank you.
Okay.
Professor Rowland.
Thank you. So I've entitled my paper, Defending Hellenism. The Regensburg Address belongs to a suite of public lectures by Ratzinger delivered to an academic audience. In each one of these addresses, he emphasized the same principle, that Christianity is the religion of the Logos. So why did he constantly return to this principle? This university's most famous philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre, once wrote that when reading any particular scholar, it's important to know against whom he is writing. Within what particular controversy is this or that particular contention to be situated? Scholars characteristically invite us not simply to assert X, but to assert X rather than Y or Z. And we will often only understand the point of asserting X if we know what Y and Z are. That's MacIntyre's insight in how to read great scholars, how to analyse their work. Ask the question, against whom are they writing? Applying this principle to the suite of Ratzinger's academic addresses, one asks the question, who would disagree with the proposition that Christianity is the religion of the Logos? Some possible answers are, first, the usual quintet of German villains: Luther, Kant, Marx, Nietzsche, and Harnack. These are all names external to the Catholic intellectual tradition. To this list, however, could be added any number of contemporary theologians who claim to be working within the tradition, for whom the relationship between logos and ethos is flipped in favour of the priority of ethos, or, as they would sometimes say, praxis. So to begin with the quintet, in the Regensburg Address, Ratzinger offers a genealogy of modernity in which the Greek component in the Catholic intellectual tradition is systematically undermined in what he calls a three-stage program of de-Hellenization. In the first stage, Luther leads the quintet by seeking to purify Christianity of its dependence on Greek philosophy. In the Regensburg Address, Ratzinger does not offer an in-depth account of Luther's contribution. He simply notes that the reformers were hostile to metaphysics, and they countered it with the principle of Scripture alone. A more in-depth analysis of Luther's war against Hellenism was offered by the Jesuit Erich Schwara, another theologian with a strong association with the city of Munich, who influenced Hans von Balthasar, Karl Rahner, Edith Stein, and many other big names in the history of 20th century German Catholicism. Schwara argued that the Reformation went beyond a corrective, as typically found in earlier reforming movements, and instead proffered a total negation of the Catholic sacramental order. Shavara observed that the logical corollary of the no to the feast of Corpus Christi was the no to the intrinsic goodness of creation. Once this world is under the reign of sin, there remains only the innermost inside, which is directly related to God, to the God who is himself the Deus interior, the God inside. Hence there arises the idea of conscience alone. However, this too is no mere corrective, but becomes a solvent of any form of visible authority. Similarly, the Lutheran emphasis on the sacred word is read by Shavara as no mere positive successor to earlier Dominican reforms, exhorting the importance of the scriptures, but rather as the source of an absolute spiritualism, since any objective authority for monitoring the interpretation of scripture has become annihilated by the conscience alone principle. The absolute spiritualism then morphs into an absolute intellectualism, and with this there occurs the birth of German idealism. Finally, for the Christ alone principle of the Reformation, what matters is not the nature of God or the nature of Christ understood in Chalcedonian categories, but the question of justification. Christ appears as a divine form of man, and from here it is a short distance to the messianic humanity of Hegel and Wilhelm von Humboldt, and ultimately to the neo-Promethean man as God, as we find in Nietzsche. Now that is, I think, one of the best little summaries I've read of the work of this quintet. And I've really just summarised Shavara there because I think that he does a good job of explaining all the different moves on the intellectual chessboard that lead from Luther to Nietzsche. While the Reformation attitude toward the Greek component in the Catholic intellectual tradition kickstarts the first stage in the program of de-Hellenization, Ratzinger in the Regensburg Address described the Kantian decision to separate faith and reason, to keep the two chastely apart, as carrying the program of de-Hellenization forward with, quote, a radicalism that the reformers could never have foreseen. For Ratzinger, the reformers and Kant, taken together as a twin movement, represent the first stage of de-Hellenization. The second stage identified by Ratzinger is the liberal theology of the 19th century, represented by Harnack. Harnack follows in the trajectory of Kant as a promoter of moralism, that is, the reduction of Christianity to a humanitarian moral message. Harnack's goal was to liberate Christianity from philosophy altogether, as well as to purge it of doctrinal elements, such as faith in Christ's divinity and the belief in the Trinity. Ratzinger concludes that the end result of this second stage of de-Hellenization is that the radius of both science and reason are severely narrowed, and the question of God is made to appear unscientific. The third stage of de-Hellenization is more contemporary. It's associated with a general anti-European attitude, which surfaced in the aftermath of two world wars started in Europe and the rise of Asian and African nationalism in the 1960s, along with the developments of varieties of liberation theology. It holds that the synthesis of Greek and Christian thought in the first centuries after Christ may have been valuable for those times, but that today it has no relevance for non-European cultures. Thus, it's argued that the Greek component may be of some interest to Europeans, but it's irrelevant in outback Australia, the jungle highlands of Papua New Guinea, or the tribes living in the Amazon basin. In the Regensburg Address, Ratzinger completely rejected this argument. He said, "This thesis is not simply false, it is coarse and lacking in precision. The New Testament was written in Greek and bears the imprint of the Greek spirit. which has already come to maturity in the Old Testament development. True, there are elements in the evolution of the early church which do not have to be integrated into other cultures. Nevertheless, the fundamental decisions made about the relationship between faith and the use of human reason are part of the faith itself. They are developments consonant with the nature of faith itself. That's paragraph 52 of the Regensburg Address. When reflecting upon this three-stage attack on the Greek dimension in the Catholic intellectual tradition, one encounters the paradox that while Luther was hostile to the Greek interest in rationality, it was Kant, deeply influenced by Lutheran pietism, who did more than anyone else to exalt the faculty of reason. This paradox is a good example of the principle identified by the philosopher Robert Spemann, according to whom every speculative concept becomes internally dialectical the moment it is removed from its natural context, the moment it loses its relationship to its contrary concept. That is, faith and reason are separated, nature and grace are separated, history and ontology are separated. They turn into their dialectical opposite. This is Spemann's claim. Thus, a pietism separated from reason fosters German idealism. The exalted reason of German idealism separated from faith becomes violently irrational. Nature separated from grace ends up grotesquely unnatural. History separated from ontology ends up hostile to tradition. The body separated from the soul ends up as a machine, and a humanism divorced from God ends up as an anti-humanism. When it comes to these critical couplets, it is typical of Ratzinger that he takes the view that we can only understand one pole of the couplet with reference to the other. For example, history is only understood against the backdrop of revelation, but revelation itself is historical. Similarly, faith has a right to be missionary only if it transcends all traditions and constitutes an appeal to reason and an orientation toward the truth itself. There is, moreover, a strong Christocentrism in his theological structure. As he wrote in Introduction to Christianity, ontology represented Christologically by the theology of the Incarnation, and history represented Christologically by the theology of the cross, reveal polarities that cannot be surmounted and combined in a neat synthesis, without the loss of the crucial points in each. He said they must remain polarities that mutually correct each other, and only by complementing each other point toward the whole. In contrast to the anti-metaphysical animus of contemporary postmodern philosophy and theology, Ratzinger stood for the affirmation of both history and metaphysics. Not metaphysics without history, which might be described as the pre-conciliar problem, or history without metaphysics, the postmodern temptation. He eschews any kind of dualistic choice between the being Christology of Chalcedon and the event Christology of the New Testament. Consistent with this position, Thomas Guarino remarked, "If one abandons some form of foundationalist ontology, one's entire understanding of revelation and the role of Christian doctrine is deeply affected. Either the truth of the gospel must simply be asserted, breaking its link with a rationally elaborated infrastructure, or by opening a fissure between ontology and theology, one develops a quite different understanding of what the deposit of the faith is, how it develops, and the type of continuity and identity proper to it. Particularly affected is the type of truth mediated by it." Ratzinger was acutely aware of this issue, and thus he followed Romano Guardini in insisting that we cannot dispense with the priority of logos over ethos. That statement was initially made by Guardini, but it is taken up by Ratzinger and strongly affirmed by Ratzinger. We must maintain the priority of logos over ethos. Another author sensitive to this issue of the rejection of the priority of logos was Charles Davis, who in 1973 wrote an article about the enthusiasm of Dutch and Belgian theologians for adopting the critical theory of the Frankfurt School of Sociology. He noted, fundamental for them as a consequence of their acceptance of the Marxist unity of theory and praxis is a conviction that the permanent self-identity of the Christian faith cannot be presupposed. They reject a theoretical system of identity. Truth does not yet exist. It cannot be reached by interpretation, but it has to be produced by change. For these theologians, therefore, faith is in a strong sense mediated in history through praxis. The reason Davis's question is so important is that if critical theory or some other version of a priority of praxis theory becomes the intellectual partner for theology, then almost every branch of theology is open for a radical revision. This was recognised by Ratzinger in his Principles of Catholic Theology when he wrote, "If the word orthopraxis is pushed to its most radical meaning, it presumes that no truth exists that is antecedent to praxis, but rather that truth can be established only on the basis of a correct praxis. Theology becomes then no more than a guide to action, which by reflecting on praxis continually develops new modes of praxis. If not only redemption, but truth as well, is regarded as post hoc, then truth becomes the product of man, and man, who is no longer measured against truth, becomes himself a product." In his book, The Nature and Mission of Theology, Ratzinger further endorsed the judgment of Albert Gores that there is no doctrine of Jesus without a skeleton, without dogmatic principle. And he endorsed Gores' description of the mentality that faith propositions do not matter because the important thing is contact with the spiritual atmosphere as, quote, the Hinduization of the faith. For Ratzinger, truth is not discerned by taking opinion polls and searching for a consensus. In an essay published in his book Democracy in the Church in 1970, he remarked, "Indeed, by its very nature, faith is suspended when it is subjected to the majority principle. Why should Mr. Muller or Mrs. Huber be able to oblige me to believe this or that, which they more or less happen to think is right? Why should I be obliged to believe what a majority passes today that might tomorrow be replaced by an opposing majority? Either there is a different authorization in the faith of the Church than that of human opinion, or there is not, and if not, there's no belief." One may conclude, therefore, that when Ratzinger addressed the academic community of the University of Regensburg in 2007, he was responding to problems on two fronts. The external front of German idealism and what a quintet of German philosophers had made of reason, having decoupled it from faith, and the internal front of a new fundamental theology, initially popular in Germany, Belgium and Holland, where the influence of Frankfurt School critical theory is strong. The central hallmark of this new fundamental theology is its inversion of the relationship between logos and ethos. And from the position of the priority of ethos, we see a convergence with the ideas of the Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo, who separates caritas from veritas and demonizes veritas as the central plank of a master narrative. This is my final section. A Christianity that would separate veritas from caritas and adopt a caritas alone principle would be, in Ratzinger's terms, a Hinduized Christianity. Those who follow this intellectual path have a problem with what Cyril O'Regan last evening in his address described as the disposition of humility and gratitude in the face of revelation. They believe that truth is something we construct for ourselves, not something we receive as a divine gift. The German philosopher Peter Wurst, another of a young Joseph Ratzinger's intellectual heroes, analysed this spiritual pathology in his book Naivety and Piety, in which he counsels scholars on how to recover their faith once they had lost it by going down the Kantian rabbit hole. What began as a separation of faith from reason has ended with a separation of reason from love. We have arrived back in the 1960s with the Beatles and their mantra, all we need is love, and with this a kind of Hinduization of Christianity. Moreover, as Professor Remy Brague argued in his presentation this morning, there is no culture without the goodness of being. Once veritas and caritas are decoupled, caritas turns into its dialectical opposite, and we have the cult of narcissism. The only kind of culture that grows out of this is an anti-culture, a culture that hates culture. Ratzinger's defence of Hellenism was a plea to keep not only faith and reason, but also love and reason together, and to thereby foster a high culture built on the incarnation, in which divinity and humanity were distinguished but not separated. Thank you.
As a long-time moderator of panels, it's normally a grave danger when a speaker has handwritten notes to conclude her lecture, but you finished under time, as did Father Kevin, so there's great pressure on you, Father Clemenzia, to keep the streak going.
Thank you. A vast bibliography exists, including recent articles and scientific contributions, which systematically argues the theological and cultural implication of Pope Benedict's speech at the University of Regensburg. These studies focus particularly on the relationship between faith and reason. Indeed, the talk given by the Pope can certainly be considered a pivotal moment not only concerning the relationship between faith and reason, but also concerning that between theology and philosophy, or between theology and the various scientific fields. It is a binomial that defies extrinsic understanding, as if the terms were two ontologically irreconcilable realities, thus demanding comprehension that transcends any dualistic reduction. The Bavarian thinker is often object to such a reduction, speaking instead of the reasonableness of faith. Not to act with logos is contrary to God's nature. This was the focus of his reflection. With these words, Benedict explains how the intimate relationship between the logos and God is not only the result of Hellenistic reflection, but finds its true and concrete condition of possibility in the theologic of the prologue of John's Gospel. It is about the becoming flesh of the divine Logos, of the one who, being God, is eternally related to God, o Theos, that is Father. There is therefore a certain conformity between the biblical Logos and its Greek counterpart, rather than split modernity as roads. For this reason, the Pope explains the encounter between the biblical message and Greek thought did not happen by change, but by means of a journey which went through several historical stages. From the revelation of the name of God by the burning bush, through which he finally distinguished himself from every other deity, to the Babylonian exile, where the revelatory formula AM appears again. From the late wisdom literature to the translation of the Septuagint, which does not consist in a simpler literary work of translation, but, Ratzinger writes, in an important step in the history of revelation. For Pope Benedict, this unity in the Logos represented the starting point for the exploration of the interaction between Greek thought and Christianity, and for showing the various attempts throughout the centuries to enact a real de-Hellenization process of the Christian experience, as if with such a process they had in mind a return to a pure origin of the Christological event, untouched by any subsequent contamination with Hellenistic thought. Without delving into that phenomenon here, the Pope reached a conclusion that becomes the starting point for this reflection. That is the new unity between faith and reason. All this, Pope Benedict explained, is achievable only if we overcome the self-imposed limitation of reason to the empirically falsifiable, and if we once more disclose its vast horizons. What especially does this new way of holding together faith and reason consist of? In other words, is there a place where they can come together in such a unity that each knows a deep and radical inner expansion within itself? Instead of further investigating the relationship between faith and reason in the theological and philosophical contribution of Joseph Ratzinger, which has already been extensively dealt with and explored in this brief reflection, I intend to delve into the existence of this hypothetical place where the new mode of relationship between faith and reason advocated by the Bavarian theologian can actually be achieved. It must be a place that is not arbitrary, not especially constructed by scholars to reach desired conclusions, but a reality that, while deeply belonging to each creature, is the fruit of something that is constantly offered to it. While recognizing that Ratzinger did not state this explicitly and systematically, through a cross-sectional restructuring of his writings, one can examine whether this decisive place is indeed experience. We can delve into this relationship starting from another of Ratzinger's writing from 1980, which focuses on the relationship between faith and experience. From the beginning, he recognized how both the concept of experience and that of faith do not have an univocal meaning. Yet, he states, with these two questions, it is ultimately the structure of the human spirit and the human knowledge as such that is being broached, the question of how God can enter into the human spirit. But this question, whatever it is approached from the concept of God or from the nature of man, leads us to the most profound depths of our understanding of reality per se. In other words, experience represents an accessible place where it is possible to know God, the deep nature of every man and woman, and the whole of reality. Ratzinger rests his reflection of the Aristotelian axiom, which was embraced by Thomas Aquinas, nihil est in intellectu quod non prius fuerit in sensu. Sensible perception represents the door through which the creature can achieve some form of knowledge. The theoretical background of this statement is supported by a particular conception of the relationship within soul and body. The way of human cognition always requires the combination of corporal instrument and spiritual appropriation. And this also applies to knowledge of God. One can reach it through the intervention of the senses. It is interesting to observe, for example, that in the sequence of the Bene Creator, it says, accende lumen sensibus. This consideration may appear to be solely philosophical, but in reality, Ratzinger says it has a clear scriptural basis. Just think, for example, of the way Jesus communicated with his interlocutors, his teaching in parables, in fact, revealed to every man and woman the path to the mystery of God. Indeed, according to Ratzinger, the parables have two main starting points. On the one hand, they transcend the realm of creation in order, by this transcendence, to draw it above itself to the Creator. On the other hand, they accept the past historical experience of faith, that is, they prolong the parable that have grown up with the history of Israel. Ratzinger adds a third function of the parables. They also interpret the simple world of everyday life in order to show how a transcendence to what is more than just human stereotype occurs in it. Parables, therefore, offer a glimpse of the everyday in the light of something that has a meaning beyond the immediately perceptible, but which has always been inherent in reality itself. This allows one to gain a new perspective of the human, with the purpose of discerning the existence of a meaning that, at first glance, seemed not to be there. Parables convey a content of faith through reality itself. In summary, Ratzinger says, we can say that the parable has a twofold structure. The content of faith is made transparent in the reality of the senses, and this knowledge of the faith has in its turn a reciprocal effect on the world of the senses, making it comprehensible as a movement that transcends itself. It is interesting to observe how the cognitive method of the parable does not offer a new meaning to things, but it is a tool that can bring out a meaning already inherent in reality. In this way, it manifests a profound dynamism that exists in the real. Ratzinger again writes, reality is self-transcendence, and when man is led to transcend it, he not only comprehends God, but for the first time also understands reality and enables himself and creation to be what they were meant to be. Of course, this is made possible as much by the content of parable as by a gaze of the faith, oculata fides, which is made separable by grace to grasp the truth and underlies all that is. Of course, explained the German theologian, experience cannot be exhaustive insofar as God does not allow himself to be enclosed in human cognitive categories. He is the Deus semper maior. Hence, explained Ratzinger, whatever is discovered to exist, God always transcends. In other words, precisely when we are most aware of the potentiality of the sensory world for revealing God, we must at the same time hold fast to the knowledge that God alone is divine, that he can be seen only when I do not stand still, but regard experience as a road and set out upon it. Experience, therefore, is where reason and faith occur simultaneously, although non-exhaustive knowledge of God can be attained. God is much greater even than our experience of God. On the contrary, it gives rise to a whole dynamic of experience, and itself creates new experiences. In these words, we can glimpse the Augustinian reflection, according to which the heart of every creature remains in a state of restlessness until the moment it has found God. But even finding him engenders a greater desire to continue seeking him, never ceasing. We can still delve into what Ratzinger calls the specifics of the Christian experience. let us briefly return to what is said about the gaze of faith as the possibility of grasping a dynamism of self-transcendence that is present in reality itself, and of putting ourselves on that same journey. All this, as Ratzinger explains, was much easier in the past. To avoid considering the transcendence of reality, which occurs through faith, as the effect of one's personal effort, the author introduces a biblical example, the dialogue between Jesus and the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well. This is an encounter that takes place in a situation of daily life within basic need, thirst of water. During the dialogue between the two, several shifts occur. The first is from a mere empirical experience to the awareness of a deeper thirst, the thirst of living. Jesus, however, is not satisfied with this level either, and wants to bring the woman to a further plane. At this juncture, we witness a peculiar dialogue in which the two interlocutors share the same words, but each is speaking on a different level of meaning from the other. Jesus wants to get to the center of the Samaritan woman's life, directing and accompanying her desire from the need for something to the totality of her existence. In other words, the purpose of the dialogue is no longer addressed to something, but to herself. At that moment, in the transition from the something to the I, the shift from empirical and experimental knowledge to experiential knowledge takes place. And it is precisely the road that leads her toward the desire for something that only God could fulfill and accomplish. Christ was able to accompany the woman to the supernatural through the recognition of natural thirst. So far, we have seen how, within experience, faith is shown to be a true and proper cognitive event. It is indeed the precise and decisive event that generates in the believing subject the desire to delve ever deeper into its nature. For this reason, faith, writes Ratzinger in his introduction to Christianity, is not a blind surrender to the irrational. On the contrary, it is a movement towards the logos, the ratio, towards meaning, and so towards truth itself. For in the final analysis, the ground on which man takes his stand cannot possibly be anything else but the truth revealing itself. The Samaritan woman's ratio does not strive to broaden her own existential horizon, but it is reached in an encounter by the Logos of God Himself. It is the latter who works in this woman, again through her full freedom and expansion of her ratio, offering her a new capacity to look at herself, at reality, to the extent that she recognizes something great and true, who encountered her precisely in her everyday life. This is why Ratzinger goes so far as to say that in Christian faith, reason comes to light. Moreover, faith is a new beginning of thinking, which is given to us. And this novelty flows precisely from the encounter with Christ. He, writes Ratzinger, is the new beginning, the point of departure for our thinking. The Logos incarnate attuned itself to a human Logos, expanding it from within, and through human Logos, he has revealed himself. The divine Logos communicated itself in a reasonable way, that is, attuning itself to reason itself. And in this attunement, the latter experienced its own true expansion until it was made capable of receiving the divine Logos. But, as Paul describes, something more happens. Yet I live, no longer I, but Christ lives in me. It is the phenomenon of incorporation into Christ, or Christification. That is the deepest meaning of the term conversion. Human reason is expanded by the encounter with the incarnate Logos, and from that moment it participates in the nous Christou. And the only place where all this can be experienced continues to be reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Three very profound reflections, lectures. We have time for questions. I'm going to take the moderator's privilege of asking the first, and it might be rude because it goes beyond the Regensburg lecture, but you've given us great reflections on the Regensburg lecture, and I found myself wondering in particular, when you invoked McIntyre, Professor Rowland, of thinking about the relationship of faith and reason that Ratzinger himself, Pope Benedict XVI, embodied, which is he was an academic theologian and then a member of the hierarchy, and then a particular member of the hierarchy at the head of what was then the CDF, it's now the DDF, and an even more particular member of the hierarchy as the Holy Father. To what extent would you say, alternative history is always bogus, but it's fun. So what would his theology have looked like had he not become a member of the hierarchy, the head of the CDF, and the Holy Father? Or do we think there's just an organic development that would have been exactly the same had he not occupied the roles that he had occupied, if that question makes sense?
I think his theological trajectory would have been exactly the same. But I think if he hadn't been made Pope, he may have been able to solve the schism with the Russians and the Greeks. I think I would have given him that job and just said, fix it. I think he could have done that. Also, in his book, Principles of Catholic Theology, he says that the biggest crisis for Catholic theology in the 20th century was coming to an understanding of the mediation of history in the realm of ontology. He calls that the biggest single crisis. And he says Rana understood it, but he didn't think Rana had the right solution. And I sometimes wish that, he'd had, say, 2 years in which to just write about that problem. So I don't think that Ratzinger's magisterial positions change the trajectory of his theology. I don't think that he was being super cautious simply because he was occupying a magisterial position. But I think there were many other things he could have done had he not been elected to the papacy, I think. Providence knows better than me whether that was a good idea or not. But when we talk about these alternative histories, some of my colleagues in Australia love to talk about, what if instead of Ratzinger as Pope, we had Schola as Pope? And what would we have given Ratzinger to do during those years? And my comment is sort out the problem with the Russians and the Greeks, because I think he had the intellectual capacity to do that, in the historical and cultural sensitivity to do that.
Santiago?
Thank you, Father Bill. Thank you for an excellent panel, to the three of you. My question has more to do with what Professor Rowland and Father Flannery talked to us about. I was wondering whether They might help us understand better the kind of conversation that Emperor Manuel II had with the Persian gentleman. To what extent, assuming that the emperor was closer to the truth, to what extent could his interlocutor have a fruitful conversation with him without adopting his culture, without Hellenization?
A good question. I mean, one thing to bear in mind about that, Manuel II's discourse is that it's primarily his discourse. So, and people speculate that it was put together well after the conversation. So, so you don't get it's described as a dialogue, but in fact it's not. The question of isn't even kind of the extent to which reason, even Greek reason, comes into Islamic thought is another important issue, and so we know that we've got people like Avicenna and Averroes, et cetera, and who really, in many ways, kind of gave, in particular, the Aristotelian tradition, to the West, and so there's not an incompatibility there. On the other hand, the one Islamic scholar that Ratzinger speaks about is, it's clear that he's not coming from anything even resembling, kind of Aristotle, or to my mind, even Plato. It's simply, it's a very authoritarian, or kind of an approach which, as Ratzinger says, and I take it as his quotations are worth kind of attending to, that it's something that really does accept the possibility that our reason has nothing to do whatsoever with God's reason. So I hope that helps.
Yeah. Look, I'm not any kind of authority on Islamic philosophy or theology, but my general understanding is that there was this moment in the medieval period when Islamic thought was tending in this Hellenistic direction with the discovery of Aristotelian documents, and somehow something happened and that trajectory didn't go forward. Now, my history is not good enough to say what went wrong, but so for some reason there was a tendency toward a Hellenistic moment, but it just wasn't strong enough and it didn't last. And I think my understanding of Ratzinger is that it is necessary, that the Hellenistic component is not something that is dispensable. Yeah.
I have a question for Father Clemenzia. And I'm sorry if I maybe didn't understand the entire argument you were presenting. But I was just thinking about experience as the place where reason and faith might meet. And I was thinking of a movement that happened among women religious, particularly in the 70s and 80s. And the whole idea was that rather than obedience to the church and obedience to a superior, the person's experience was the place of encounter and the place to find truth. And it ended up in a very subjectivized, what I would consider misleading understanding of the role of reason and faith. And so I'm just wondering if you have a thought about how experience remains grounded and a participation in the Logos, how we recognize the difference between the way personal experience can be just the autonomous conscience versus an experience that's a participation in the light of reason and in the light of Christ.
Father's going to answer in Italian, and I will offer Cliff's notes in English.
Quando Ratzinger scrive questo testo,
So when Ratzinger writes specifically this text,
aveva anche in mente il concetto di carattere
so he had in mind also the concepts from Karl Rahner
dei cristiani anonimi.
of anonymous Christians.
Proprio per questo nel presentare la benedizia dell'esperienza,
So exactly for this reason, with the anonymous Christians in mind, when Benedict then talks about the personal experience in this text.
al tempo stesso dice che l'esperienza non è sufficienza per dire no.
So the experience itself is not sufficient to speak about God.
Perché Dio è più grande dell'esperienza.
Because God himself is greater than the experience of God. So the experience of God is always insufficient to speak about God in his own being.
Al tempo stesso Ratzinger presenta anche un altro fenomeno,
So at the same time, Ratzinger presents another phenomenon in the text.
che era appunto un certo individualismo
So a certain kind of individualism,
mischiato a spiritualismo,
so mixed together with a spiritualism.
dove si concepiva l'esperienza religiosa di Dio
So we're in that mix of spiritualism and individualism, where the experience of this, the experience of God in the self. So
a prescindere dal mondo ecclesiale.
the experience of God in the individual, separate from the communal experience of the ecclesial we. So the difference between the individual I and the experience of God, as opposed to the I located in the we of the church, the us of the church.
Proprio per questo c'è un testo molto bello di Ratzinger
So,
sul natura e compito della teologia,
so based on this, in another one of Benedict's texts on the nature of theology, the nature and I forget the title in English, nature and mission of theology. So in that text,
c'è scritto proprio come l'esperienza del Dio deve essere sempre legata all'esperienza del mondo ecclesiale.
Ratzinger writes where the experience of the I must always be tied to the experience of the we, the ecclesial experience.
Però nonostante tutte queste difficoltà storiche,
So setting all of these historical difficulties aside,
per Ratzinger c'è una questione fondamentale.
so for Ratzinger there's one fundamental question.
E lui chiaramente nella introduzione al catechismo della Chiesa Cattolica,
So in his introduction to the Catechism of the Catholic Church,
lui arriva a dire che la storia, la realtà,
so he comes to say that history itself, that reality itself,
è dogmatica.
is dogmatic.
La realtà stessa è dogmatica.
So reality itself is dogmatic.
Perché tutto questo?
Why?
Perché Cristo, diciamo, il verbo divino nell'incarnarsi,
So the divine word in taking on flesh
è entrato in questa realtà
enters into this reality.
e dunque la realtà di per sé stessa è dogmatica.
Therefore, because of the incarnation, reality itself is dogmatic.
E anche perché l'unico modo in cui Cristo può raggiungere la creatura oggi
So the only way in which Christ can reach creation today
è attraverso la realtà.
is through reality. There is no mechanism for Christ to enter into our lives other than the reality into which he was born and to taking on flesh.
Perciò contro la dimensione del cristiano anonimo,
So against the idea of the anonymous Christian,
contro la dimensione del soggettivismo spirituale,
so against spiritual subjectivism.
ma comunque la realtà rimane per Ratzinger dogmatica, una realtà dogmatica.
So the reality in its dogmatic nature stands in contrast to either the experience of the anonymous Christian or that sort of subjective individualism, or the subjective spiritualism.
Il fondamento teologico dell'incarnazione.
So based all on the theological foundation of the incarnation itself. I hope that answers your question.
Anyone else? If not, well, thank you very much. And now you can go and look at the sun.